Warmest greetings to you, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. Now,
Thanks.
Jacinta, you have met many of our fantastic Mannkal scholars at the various Friedman conferences, but it's so good to have this opportunity for you to speak directly to them today. And we've had some fabulous speaking stars over the years for this event, but nobody has created the level of interest such as you have to this evening. So let me start off by asking you some questions, because I think the questions I'd like to ask you is about leadership, because I feel that leadership is sadly lacking in the political sphere and in the business sphere, and linking with leadership is courage. I'd like to sort of touch on the word courage, and what one needs, what courage you need to actually say what you believe in rather than wait to see what the opinions of others are to form your own opinions. You resolving things from very first principles. So could I ask you to give us some introductory comments, and then just after that I'll come back and continue the questions. So Jacinta, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ron. I think you know the world that we live in today requires people to toe the line of political correctness, and it seems to have influenced people on all levels. And certainly, you know, there are those that are concerned about their positions and the threat on their positions if they don't toe the line of political correctness. But if we all actually stood our ground and said, no, we need to actually be honest, we need to be able to have open, honest, fair debate without tearing each other down. The more of us that did that, the less opportunity that, you know, those who peddle political correctness would have to try to shut us down. I think for me personally, I've got a lot to lose in terms of the people that I represent are very vulnerable people who have been voiceless for a long time, and which is probably the reason why I decided to go down the path of putting my hand up for election in the Federal Senate. It's why my mother chose to do what she did, to become a Minister of the Crown in the former Giles government in the Northern Territory, because it was understanding what goes on the ground, but without that actually being articulated where it needed to be articulated, where laws are created and where, you know, those laws and those decisions impact all Australians, but particularly those most vulnerable Australians. And I think you have to start from a place of honesty if you actually want to resolve some of those issues. And for me and my family, we, you know, it's a matter of saving lives. That's what it is. I think as a nation, I think we're quite a comfortable nation. We're one of the leading nations in the world, and we're very, very privileged. And I think that's what sort of lent itself to this idea of, well, you know, many of us are quite privileged, and we should therefore, you know, listen to the voices that have been, I guess, pushing guilt politics on us as a country. And if we feel privileged, it's not our place to try to argue those, but that's what democracy is about. It's about drawing a line in the sand and taking a position, an honest position. And I think, and I feel like fear is what controls a lot of leaders these days. Fear of, you know, whatever repercussions they might imagine that they might be confronted with if they're actually being honest. It shouldn't be about a popularity contest, really. It shouldn't be about, you know, ensuring that everybody loves you, because ultimately, I think no leader globally has ever been extremely popular, where they could make decisions and go ahead and, you know, please everybody. It's certainly not what it's about. The understanding that you are not going to please everybody is what you have to come to terms with. It's certainly what I've come to terms with over the years, and I think Australians in general are just are looking for that. They're looking for people who are real, I guess.
Fantastic, Jacinta. You actually speak for a lot of people. A lot of Australians feel that they're not represented at all at the moment. So that's fantastic. You know, I had a long involvement in successful Aboriginal partnerships in farming at Esperance and in mineral exploration around Kalgoorlie. And during those times, I've witnessed many government policies that actually achieve exactly the opposite to their original intent. And I'm just wondering if that's your experience throughout Australia and particularly in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, absolutely. From very far back, I mean, there's this notion, I think, that we have the highest rates of incarceration amongst Indigenous Australians, and there's an argument that is that Aboriginal people have been locked up ever since colonisation, and it's just been worse ever since. And this is not in fact true. In the early 1900s, while Aboriginal people were sort of pushed into missions and taken off their lands, which was very unfortunate, but it happened historically. And there were those who were incarcerated for things like, spearing cattle. While there were levels of incarceration of Indigenous people around that time, at the beginning of the 1900s, this began to change. It began to lower. By 1905, there was in Queensland in particular, those percentages began to lower to around, I think it was 5% for Indigenous men incarcerated in Queensland, and by 1915 there were no Aboriginal women incarcerated, and so these rates decreased historically and during that time, because a lot of Aboriginal people were beginning to become part of the workforce. They were working as stockmen and women. They were taking on jobs and taking on those sorts of roles, and I guess transitioning into a different way of life. But it wasn't until the equal pay decision was passed, which with good intentions, of course. The equal pay decision was passed, but the outcome of that meant that a lot of Aboriginal people, particularly in the Northern Territory, lost their jobs because station owners couldn't afford to pay them, the equal wage. And then that was coupled with welfare and access to alcohol. And that is when we began to see our levels of incarceration increase dramatically from there and be maintained all this time. So, the equal pay decision was a decision made out of good intentions, but hasn't been, it's created terrible consequences. Another is obviously, while it was wonderful to have our land back and land rights in the places like the Northern Territory, we're land rich and dirt poor. So, while it's communally owned, there's not the opportunity for economic development. So Aboriginal people live on their land, have that, the whole spiritual connection thing and the romanticism of culture. It's wonderful to, have that, but we should be able to have the opportunity to create economic development opportunities, to be the job creators in our communities, and that hasn't occurred yet. There are a lot of well-intended sort of policies out there which have had really dire consequences. Another one is the fact that states and territories have followed the lead in terms of what the outcomes of the stolen generation have recommended, that Aboriginal kids are treated differently to all other Australian kids. So if they're in a dysfunctional situation, pretty much the priority is for them to be connected to culture and country. And again, that's that romanticism. But you can't have those meaningful connections if your family is completely and utterly dysfunctional. And we have big families, and keeping children connected to some kin further on in the family doesn't necessarily remove them from the dysfunction. So what we should be doing is putting kids in homes and with families, regardless of their cultural heritage or their race, should be putting them in homes that can meet their needs, that can uphold their human rights, that can love and care for them. But that's not what the focus is with the way the kinship policy works and the directives that have been handed down as a result of the stolen generation. And it's a completely different set of circumstances now than what it was previously. So there's a lot of policy across the board that's been well intended, but this had dire consequences.
Okay. Now, Jacinta, I'm a great believer in the Australian Constitution, because I see the Constitution as protecting us citizens from rapacious governments. And could this voice constitutional amendment that's being proposed be yet another example of good intentions that could easily go astray?
It's one of those on steroids, in fact. The problem with the voice is the fact that there's so many governance structures that are failing within the Indigenous industry. We have land councils, we have corporations, we have raft of different organisations that their governance structures aren't working. As it stands, there are 999 corporations as of the last estimates that haven't met their reporting requirements for the last 2 financial years, and the governance structures within them are clearly obviously failing, but these are organisations that are funded to probably predominantly overcome disadvantage for Indigenous Australians. So if all that mess sits underneath this overarching bureaucracy, how can anything positive come of it? I had a conversation recently with somebody about the fact that even in structures like the land councils here in the Northern Territory, ultimately you have an executive. Some of the members of the executive are in fact illiterate. In traditional terms, Aboriginal people, when it comes to decision making, will often follow the status quo. They won't want to speak out against something because speaking out against an issue can very much lead to violence, and so they'll avoid confrontation and sit there and nod in agreement, which, for a lot of vulnerable Indigenous Australians whose first language is not English, who haven't had a great education, who are still connected to the traditional cultural way of doing things, they can very much be influenced and manipulated, and we see it a lot. We see it a lot in a lot of these governance structures, and it occurs across the board, and I see this voice model as providing the opportunity to do exactly that. I mean, we need to audit and review the structures that already exist to understand where the successes are and support those successes, but do away with the failures if they can't be reinstated appropriately. And there's often no accountability, no real accountability. So things don't change in that regard. And now the proponents of the voice are seeking to establish a whole entire overarching bureaucracy on top of the mess that already exists. And that is very, very dangerous as far as I'm concerned. We need to clean up our mess before we even go anywhere. Something like that.
Thank you, Jacinta. I think you've answered a lot of our questions on that one. Now, if I could move back to our central theme of leadership, I sense that Australians are hungry for a leadership that will focus on policies that will bring us all together as one nation, rather than pursue these race-based constitutional amendments. Now, let me bring it to a conclusion by asking for your suggestions of such policies that we can all move. We got a fabulous country. We've got to get it moving again. So please.
Look, absolutely, and I think a lot of the demise of Indigenous Australia and the inability to close the gap has been because there's been a primary focus on our race as opposed to our needs. And while Indigenous Australians, some Indigenous Australians are amongst our most vulnerable Australians, not all Aboriginal people are disadvantaged. You're not automatically disadvantaged because you're an Aboriginal person in this country. There's some really successful Aboriginal people, and I'm one of those examples, I guess. And I didn't need a voice to get to where I got to. And many others who were successful as well didn't need a voice to get to where they got to. So our focus should be about serving Australian people on the basis of need. And I believe that'll bring Australians together. Eventually what I think we should aim for is the need for there not to be an Indigenous Affairs Minister, for there not to be all these organisations that exist primarily for the focus on Indigenous Australians. Ultimately, we all just want to be Australians as one. And the idea of reconciliation, I think, has been weaponised against non-Indigenous Australians to suggest, well, this is how high you must jump for reconciliation to occur. And as far as I'm concerned, reconciliation is about people coming to the table together and putting something on the table to offer to everybody sitting at that table. And I feel like that's the direction we need to go. We need to certainly have some pride in our country. We're one of the greatest countries on the face of the earth, and we don't celebrate it enough. Many Australians have been convinced that self-flagellation is how we must conduct ourselves, as opposed to recognising how wonderful is our nation. How wonderful is it that there are those from other parts of war-torn nations that want to come here and make this their home. We've got to see what it is they see in our nation, and recognise that we've all contributed to it. Everybody, we have a shared Australian culture that each and every one of us has contributed to, that each and every one of us, our ancestors, have contributed to, and we should be very proud of that. And they're the sorts of conversations we need to start having and speaking in those terms. That's how we bring about, a country where we feel like we're one and we're together again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jacinta. And on behalf of us, all of us here tonight, we thank you sincerely. And I look forward to our next meeting somewhere around the capital cities. Thank you, Jacinta, once again.